Hello everyone, and welcome to video number 2 for chapter 26. And on this one, we're going to be talking about the Atlantic slave trade. You know, it goes without saying that the slave trade had a tremendous impact on numerous continents. Obviously Africa, but also North and South America, even to a lesser extent Europe and Asia. It was the most profitable merchant enterprise of the 17th century, and it resulted in population shifts that are still seen to this day. So first, let's talk about foundations of slavery. It's important to remember that Europeans did not invent slavery. I'm not giving them a pass for the role that they played in African slavery. They played horrific parts in it, but they did not bring the concept of slavery to Africa. It existed since ancient times all over the world, and Africa was no exception. So, let's talk a little bit about that. It became common among Bantu people with the spread of agriculture. Now, most slaves were POWs, right? You have depictions here of slaves being transported, kind of with logs tied around their necks and in bondage and so forth. Some of them were criminals. That wasn't quite as common. And even sometimes social outcasts could be made into slaves. Now, slavery in Africa became widespread mostly due to differing African legal standards. You see, African law doesn't recognize private property. So wealth, therefore, doesn't come from land accumulation the way that it does in places like China and medieval Europe. Wealth could come, though, from owning more slaves, since more slaves working for you resulted in more crop cultivation. So it really wasn't about how much land you owned, it was about how much slaves you owned. However, the treatment of slaves was generally, and I don't want to make it seem like it was great, because you look at the pictures and it shows that they still could be treated somewhat inhumanely. But generally speaking, it was better than what we saw the treatment of African slaves in the Americas. And that was mostly due because there was no racial or very small ethnic differences between slave and owner, right? Kind of more similar to what we saw in ancient Rome. It was not unheard of, actually, for slaves to be assimilated into family and kinship groups within a generation or so. Now, prior to shipping slaves across the Atlantic, Africans were also used in the Islamic slave trade. You see the picture here, Arab merchant kind of, shipping slaves off. It never reached the numbers of the Atlantic slave trade, but Africans were sold in Islamic lands in North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, even India to a lesser extent. And this continued actually into the early 20th century. Now that, as I said, was minor. By far, the largest slave trade in human history was the Atlantic slave trade. It began relatively small, with Portugal bringing Africans to work on plantations on those small islands in the Atlantic, like the Canary Islands and so forth. But when it really started to explode was with the European conquest of the Americas. You look at the map, by 1700, both North and South America was quickly being gobbled up by European countries. Right, you see the purple with the Spanish throughout Mexico and along the Pacific coast of South America. You see Portuguese Brazil. Here, remember, that was divided by the Treaty of Tordesillas. And then you've got the British 13 colonies and New France, French Canada up there. Okay. So, you really start to see an increased European involvement in this. Now, both Spain and Portugal were quick to gobble up all of this land that they quickly realized was excellent for large-scale cash crop agriculture. The Spanish never found the gold that they hoped, but they realized that there was a fortune to be made in farming, such as cotton, tobacco, and sugar, and so forth. Now, natives, like we talked about in previous chapters, were the first labor force to be used, but disease completely decimated their population, so Europeans turned to Africa for laborers. In 1518, the first shipment of slaves went directly from West Africa to the Caribbean. Spain brought Africans to Mexico a few years later, and by the early 1600s, the English had brought African slavery to North America. Slavery connected several continents in a trade relationship known as triangular trade. Now, the reason it's called triangular trade is because it has 3 points to it. You've got the Americas, you've got Europe, you've got Africa. Let me erase this. Now, the basics of it, and I do mean basics, are raw materials from the Americas to Europe, manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, slaves from Africa to the Americas. You look at a little more specific map, And the basics are still the same, okay? It just gives you a breakdown of a lot of the raw materials and so forth that would have been shipped from the Americas, whether it be the Caribbean, North, South America, back to Europe. And then you've got the European manufactured goods, especially guns. Alcohol was another big one that they used to ship down, but guns was the biggest. And then these would be exchanged in Africa for slaves. Okay, so slaves are obviously the big part here. And then we'll come back to this, talk about the Middle Passage in a second. All of these goods here, okay, a lot of this stuff, the rice, the silk, the sugar, molasses, and so forth, that was a result of slave labor. So it was obviously all connected with each other. And then when it got back to Europe, those goods would be exchanged and processed for more money, and then it would start all over again. So it was just kind of this never-ending cycle. Now, the transporting of slaves was violent at all stages, but by far the most notorious part of the journey, when that started in African village when they were first kidnapped, until they ended up in the American plantation, was what I underlined before, the Middle Passage. African slaves were packed into cargo holds. Well, actually, first, let me show you this. The reason why it's called the Middle Passage is that this made up the bulk of it here, okay? Kind of this equatorial journey in between West Africa and Caribbean and South America. You notice not too many of them coming up here. I'll talk about more of that later, and a lot were coming to Spain. This was mostly due to the intensely harsh conditions that African slaves labored under on sugar plantations, especially in Brazil. Okay, along the eastern coast of South America. They had a very, very short life expectancy. They were literally worked to death. So they were constantly in the need for replenishing new slaves. In any event, let me erase this. Okay, so crew members, they would pack them in as tightly as possible, very little in the way of open air. You see a diagram here where this was meant, drawn up by the ship's captains and the ship's owners to try and say, well, how can we maximize space? How can we fit as many humans below deck as possible in order to make the most amount of money? It was very often that they didn't have enough room to stand. Sometimes they didn't even have enough room to fully extend their legs. Disease, as you can imagine, was common, and the conditions were so horrific that it was not uncommon for slaves to starve themselves in order to attempt suicide. However, this was a loss of money, so crew members would then force them to eat since they needed slaves in decent health in order to fetch the best price. Now, especially in the early years of the slave trade, the conditions were really, really rough. Where casualty rates were excessively high, sometimes as high as 50%. This was bad business, though. The more slaves that died during the voyage, the less money that you could make. So slavers started to slightly improve conditions. Okay, so just adding a little more water, making sure that they had more access to open air to cut back on disease. Very far from a pleasure cruise, though. All right, now impact of the slave trade. Let's look at the chart here. You can see that the height of it was during 1700s to, let me go back here. There we go. 1700s to 1800s. All right, we're talking about in the 18th century, where as many as 55,000 slaves were brought to the Americas per year. Now, statistics vary from source to source. All right, this one has it that, roughly about 10 million total from 1450 to 1870. The textbook puts it around 12 million. It's difficult to really get exact numbers, especially during the early years, in the 14 and 1500s. But as you can see, from the early years where they start to kind of trickle in, it just exploded. And the main reason being was because of money. There was money to be made in buying and selling slaves, and there was money to be made in slave labor all throughout the Americas. So 1700 to 1800 really exploded, but then started to taper off in the 1800s as slowly you start to see abolitionist movements, such as in the United States and other European countries, start to take effect. Britain had banned the slave trade. America had banned the importation of new slaves even a couple of decades prior to the Civil War, so it did start to decrease at that point. Excuse me. Now, the effects of the slave trade in Africa, they varied from region to region, but overall, Africa suffered serious loss, especially due to West African destabilization. West African societies were the most vulnerable to slavers and competition for slaves among Africans. It led to greater segmentations in the region. Add into the fact that you see what these guys are transporting the slaves with: guns. All right, we talked about those guns that were exchanged for the slaves. These firearms, it led to an increase in regional violence as people competed for wealth from the slave trade. It also, very interestingly, hold on, let me erase this again, led to a tremendous amount of gender disparity. All right, disparity meaning unequal amounts or unevenness. Young adult males ages 16 to 35, like you see in the painting here, they brought the highest price because they were looked at as being the most physically capable of doing manual labor. So they were the prime targets for slavers. About 2/3 of all exported slaves are male. This led to more women being left in Africa, which in turn led to higher rates of polygamy, of men taking more than one wife, and women taking on more responsibility in African society. So you start to see some changing gender roles, particularly in West Africa. So that wraps it up talking about the African slave trade. And in the next and final video for the chapter, we'll talk about these new changing African American societies that evolved from slave populations.